okay, parents, your kids are going to turn out just fine.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by FOCO. That's FOCO, F-O-C-O. If you are a parent of a child or teen with ADHD, you know how challenging it can be to keep them focused and engaged. FOCO is the all-natural solution for ADHD, whether it's for school, homework, or just everyday activities. FOCO helps your child or teen stay calm and attentive. Before trying prescription drugs like Adderall that can come with harsh side effects, I recommend you try FOCO. Visit ThinkFOCO, that's ThinkFOCO, thinkfoco.com for more information. Welcome to the Your Kids Will Be Fine podcast. I am Dr. Michael Milobsky, board-certified pediatrician, parent of 7, now grandparent of 3. Here on Your Kids Will Be Fine, for all of you that know and for the families that are new to our audience, we try to work through the tasks of parenting in the age of information overload and social media, help parents understand what is really important when it comes to the information they're getting, and that they can maybe be less anxious and be less worried about the parenting choices that they do make, because in the end, you're doing a good job and your kids will be fine. This week on the podcast, we are doing a deep dive on sleep. Sleep is so important. It's so essential to not just mental health, but metabolic health. And we know, of course, as adults, the long-term data on sleep and how poor sleep can negatively impact our brains as we age. But in the developing brain and the growing brain, the brains of a child, sleep might even be as or more important in terms of emotional balance, in terms of information processing and learning, and in terms of actually weight and metabolic health. So let's talk about the elements of sleep. We'll talk about how to set your child up and maximize their natural internal mechanisms for promoting healthy sleep routines. And what are some of the scenarios and situations that some of our parents may be running into where those can be harder and have to be managed a little bit more intensively. So our sleep-wake cycle, our internal clock, is linked to the light-dark cycle around us. And and the hormone that does that for us in our brains seems to be melatonin. And we are seeing an epidemic of sleep dysfunction, especially in middle school and high school kids. And we think that mostly that has to do with how our enmeshment with technology has affected our normal, healthy sleep patterns and has really detracted from healthy sleep. And we're seeing a lot of downstream effects from that. So first, let's talk about how the internal clock and the sleep-wake cycle works in an ideal way, in its healthiest way. So what happens is that we get up, we get moving, we open our eyes, we get natural sunlight, hopefully, in our face during the first few hours of the day. And one of the issues with, I think, current way school is set up, especially for our middle school and high school kids, that school starts so early. They have to get to school and start way before the day starts. And most middle schools and high schools offer very little in terms of structured opportunities for kids to get out and move during the day. They're simply going from class to class inside. So I think that's one of the things that makes it more difficult for us. So getting that natural light in your eye sends a signal to our the deep part of our brain that runs our circadian clock and links us into the light-dark cycle. Things that we do during the day have an impact on how that clock runs and how it impacts us later in the day when we're trying to go to sleep. Those things are exercise. Getting a decent amount of physical vigorous exercise during the day enhances our clock's ability to get us tired at the right time. 2 is our diet and what we eat and drink. So excessive amounts of caffeine, especially in the second half of the day. You're definitely going to hear a lot about how ultra-processed foods and sugar can in some kids make their internal clock work less efficiently. I think that can be, some kids are definitely more sensitive to that and some kids are less sensitive to that. And mood and stress and anxiety and other things that tend to, I think, come into play with lots of kids, especially in the middle school and high school range during the day. And then as our clock runs through the day, about 3 to 4 hours before the sun sets and darkness sets in, because our clock is very tuned into our environment, our brain, the pineal gland in our brain, releases a small amount of melatonin. It's our melatonin surge. Just to put it in perspective, it's not exactly the easiest thing to measure because it occurs deep in our brain, but what I've read in certain studies is that it's in the range of 0.13 to 0.15 milligrams. Just to compare that to what most melatonin dosing is, melatonin is often sold in 1 milligram to 5 milligram doses. So the amount we're offering people supplementally is way more than what our brain naturally produces. And that melatonin surge signals our internal clock to begin the process of getting us into sleep mode as the sun sets over the next 4 hours, and we head towards the time where we naturally want to fall asleep. So what in the later part of the day, what tends to most interrupt that is technology and unnatural light. As anyone who's a parent of a current middle school or high school child knows, they come home often with enormous amounts of homework. They're forced to be on screens because so much homework is done through the computer. And that blue light of high def screens, whether it's the phone or the laptop or a tablet, tends to increase our arousal and make it harder for our clock to put us in that sleepy state. And falling asleep and having a healthy, structured sleep is more difficult. After we fall asleep, what is supposed to happen is our brain is actually very active during sleep. It's going through a recovery and cleansing process. And for physicians who measure sleep, they measure deep and shallow waves of sleep, and the very deepest sleep being our REM sleep, which our bodies are supposed to actually be muscularly paralyzed, but there's a lot of brain activity going on, and then short arousals, and then cycling back and forth in a healthy way. That process puts our brain through a healthy recovery cleansing system. It helps integrate memory. It helps improve, when we wake up, our sense of health and energy, and less brain fog, less fatigue. And when our brains are deprived of that cycle, they can have negative long-term consequences when that occurs regularly. In children, we're talking about, it can affect attention, it can affect focus, it can affect learning. It can also affect things like our blood pressure. It can also affect things like how we relate to food, because when we're not getting enough sleep, we have certain hormones in our body that occur at higher levels, thinking about cortisol especially, which make us feel more hungry, which changes how we feel full and our normal satiety around what we eat, and can affect, therefore, our health and metabolic status as well. So sleep is really central to our kids' overall health, emotional and physical health and well-being. So what are things that parents can do, given the fact that we don't always have the most control day to day when our kids are at school, to set our kids up for healthy, impactful sleep routines? So first off is try the best we can, whenever possible and when school allows, to eliminate blue light and eliminate screens at least an hour and a half to 2 hours before target bedtime. Everybody's target bedtime in terms of how your kids and when your kids fall asleep can vary household to household. But I'm going to say most middle school and high school kids want to fall asleep between 9 and 10 p.m. That seems, for most people, a natural bedtime. So that means setting yourself up during the day as much as you can with your diet, your exercise, your natural sunlight, coming home, finishing your work, and then shutting off screens, giving your brain a buffer, because then that allows your brain to actually act on and tune into that natural melatonin surge that occurs 4 hours before you're supposed to go to sleep. And then actually there's an enormous amount of science about what kids can do to actually tune their brain to be in a healthier sleep state during that time when screens are off. One of the most potent actions to take, and this has been a very interesting topic, because if anybody is a reader or likes to read or really enjoys novels, they did functional MRIs on kids who were reading something from a page, a story that they were really into. And I think all of us know what that looks like when we're really into a story. For me, it was Harry Potter. You're actually seeing a scene in your brain. You're actually imagining what people look like and sound like without really meaning to. And there are so many pathways that circle back onto the healthy pathway in our sleep, in our brain, that are lit up when they're scanning people who are reading in that way versus scrolling on a screen. So I always advise kids during that time, if you can find something to read that you're really into that's printed on a page, not on a Kindle or a tablet. It does not have to be exceptionally high value literature. It doesn't have to be plays of Shakespeare. It doesn't have to be War and Peace. It can be graphic novels. It can be comic books. It can be any of those things. But there's something about how reading activates these pathways in your brain that puts us in that healthy, drowsy transition to sleep state when we've subtracted technology. So I think being intentional, educating our kids about the importance of it, and finding routines and modeling these routines ourselves. Once again, children respond much better when we as parents also engage in these changes that we want them to make because we know that they're healthy, and this is healthy for everybody, not just kids. And let's make sleep something that we show our kids is vitally important, and not just telling them, but showing them. So let's talk now about, there's a couple of scenarios that are increasingly common where this natural circadian clock that melatonin is a central part of may not work the same way. So one of the most common situations is a kid who truly has ADHD or also may be struggling with acute anxiety and depression. What seems to be that they don't elaborate or produce centrally the same melatonin surge in the same predictable way, and can at times need help with that. All of these other things that we do in terms of routine should be adhered to, but those kids might also need short-term melatonin supplementation. And when sleep doctors talk about melatonin supplementation, and I mentioned this in another podcast about sleep, we're talking very low dose, 4 hours before target bedtime. So on the order of 0.5 to 1 milligram. I think the biggest mistake people make is they use too high a dose, too close to bedtime. And even though it may put their kids into a drowsy state faster, it seems to not create that healthy, structured sleep all through the night, the way trying to adhering to our natural patterns might do. And of course, managing kids' anxiety and depression in ways that help improve those symptoms. And of course, that might include medication, but can also include things like mindfulness meditation, exercise, dietary changes that can all benefit our sleep patterns. And two, the other most common thing that families can run into are kids that have other kind of neurodevelopmental disabilities. So babies who are extremely premature, whose brain developed outside the womb for a very long period of time, they are going to struggle with sleep and sleep function and sleep architecture. And kids who are on the autistic spectrum. We know kids with on the autistic spectrum definitely underproduce melatonin relative to neurotypical controls. So a lot of those kids will need help with their light cycle, their circadian rhythms, and their melatonin supplementation, perhaps more than kids who don't have those challenges. So I hope this was a good deep dive on sleep. There's a lot of information out there. However, not all of it is credible. I think this is the core information that parents need to know when it comes to being intentional about sleep and sleep structure and why it's important. Remember to catch Your Kids Will Be Fine on all of your podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, anywhere you find podcasts. Please also go to our website, yourkidswillbefine.com. All the shows can be downloaded, and we'd love you to leave comments and further show suggestions. Looking forward to speaking to you guys next time.